We don't have a high level of pathogenic challenge from Newcastle disease in the US. We do still vaccinate because of the potential for that velogenic strain to occur. We have the capability to collect the samples, to run the diagnostics, to understand the picture with our vaccines. So let's go do that first.
Welcome to Unplugged, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. This week, we're going to talk about a topic that could be silently affecting flock performance and company bottom lines, Newcastle disease virus, and why your choice of vaccine strain might not be working as well as you think. Our guest in this episode is Dr. Brian Jordan, Associate Director of Global Outcomes Research for Poultry at Zoetis. He's here to share some new data from the field and his team's research revealing that not all vaccines are created equal when it comes to Newcastle. We're going to talk about why the difference could be costing you in more ways than one. So let's get right to it. Dr. Jordan, I know you're in Zoetis working in this role, but you've also got an academic background I think might be relevant for a lot of our members. If you would, give us the 30-second version of your CV for folks who may not be as familiar with your research and some of the work that you've done prior to your arrival at Zoetis.
Sure, Andy. Thank you for having me today. So I am currently with Zoetis, and actually about 2 weeks ago, I moved over into the technical director for the vet team in the U.S. poultry business. Prior to joining Zoetis, I was an assistant professor and then an associate professor at the Poultry Diagnostic and Research Center, or the PDRC as it's known, at the University of Georgia. In that time, my research mainly focused on infectious bronchitis virus and vaccination practices in the hatchery, particularly mass application. So spray, gel, any method that we would use where we're trying to vaccinate a lot of chicks at the same time. One of the major projects that I undertook when I was at the university was doing vaccine take analysis for our respiratory vaccines, again, mainly infectious bronchitis, but looking in the chicks after vaccination to understand what our vaccines were doing, how well they were taken up by the birds, and then what the cycling looked like and how those vaccines compared to each other, since we do have an array of vaccines available to the poultry industry.
I had to chuckle. We got a lot of friends over at PDRC and several PSA members. And when you actually said the full name of the center, I had to stop. He's like, everybody just says PDRC. And it took me a minute. I had to remember what the initialism stood for. All right, I want to dig into Newcastle a little bit. So let's start with the basics. What is the state of play with Newcastle in the U.S.? And what are you and your colleagues seeing in the field, hearing from industry? If you would maybe give us an overview of where we are right now with that disease and where we are in terms of vaccine relevance and protocols with this disease.
So Newcastle disease generally in the United States is very well controlled. We are lucky here that we do not have what we call exotic Newcastle, which classically is characterized as velogenic Newcastle disease. You do see that as a significant disease factor in many other countries and markets that produce chickens. It is highly lethal, very much like high-path avian influenza. Now, that being said, we do every so often have an outbreak of velogenic Newcastle. The most recent one was, I believe, maybe 2020, somewhere around that time, 2019 out in California. A lot of times those outbreaks, when we do have them, are associated with just bird movement that's not part of the commercial industry. So backyard flocks, hobby flocks, things like that. But generally, the version of the virus that we see here in the U.S. is only moderately pathogenic at worst, which makes it much easier for us here in the U.S. to think about our control strategies. Even though we don't have a high level of significant pathogenic challenge from Newcastle disease in the U.S., we do still vaccinate all of our birds against Newcastle because of the significance and the potential for that velogenic strain to occur.
Yeah, you're right. That last outbreak ran through early 2020 and in Southern California. Definitely something to be mindful of. So traditionally, when you're thinking about well-controlled, generally speaking, and so why are we talking about vaccination here? Traditionally, how have companies chosen their vaccines for Newcastle, and how would you evaluate that decision-making process?
So classically, let's go back 30, 40 years, right, live vaccines were really the only option that were available for many of our respiratory pathogens. And so there are multiple types of live attenuated Newcastle disease vaccines that are available. Fast forward as recombinant vectored vaccine technology has become prominent in the industry over the last 20 to 25 years. So we do now have recombinant vaccines available, usually an HVT vector-based vaccine where that recombinant vaccine is expressing the major antigen for Newcastle disease. And so you're stimulating immunity in that way from your vector program. Companies will use a combination of both. They may be strictly a recombinant based program, and oftentimes using the recombinant Newcastle vaccine does provide pretty good protection from the mild challenge that we typically have here in the US. But one of the drawbacks to recombinant vaccines is that you can only use one. So if you have a more significant challenge or you have another disease that you are trying to control through your recombinant program, then you would include a live attenuated vaccine in your day of age spray or gel program in the hatchery for broilers. And then if we think about our longer lived birds, layers, and breeders, they're going to get multiple applications of a live attenuated Newcastle vaccine to try to prolong that duration of immunity as those birds move out of the rearing facility, out of the pullet house, and go into either the breeder house or the layer barn.
You mentioned earlier your study, you were looking at positive take or what take rates were. Explain for people who maybe aren't as steeped in the literature on this, and I may be one of those people. What, if we talk about a positive Newcastle take, what exactly are we talking about? What are we looking at there?
Yeah, so when we look at vaccine takes in general, we are really going in to sample the bird post vaccination to understand how much vaccine that bird got. This is a relatively new concept. We started this at PDRC about, I'd say, 8, 9 years ago with infectious bronchitis, really looking at that. And honestly, we kind of fell into that accidentally, if you will. We were investigating one particular strain of bronchitis and why that vaccine seemed to behave differently than other strains. And so we started just measuring how much vaccine was in the birds post-vaccination. And so the birds, we talk about broilers, they're going through some sort of mass application device, most often a spray cabinet, but there are also gel application devices that apply the vaccines. And then we'll go in 5 to 7 days post-vaccination. And that time point is related to the biology of the vaccine we're looking at. Some viruses replicate more slowly, some more quickly. If we were looking for other pathogens that may have a different site of replication, we may take a different sample. But for bronchitis and then for Newcastle, we're looking at that upper respiratory tract. So we would go in and either sample the trachea or take a swab out of the roof of the mouth. And then we run real-time PCR. The idea of doing a vaccine take has really progressed with the feasibility and ease of doing real-time PCR in a lab, with the ability to process a lot of samples, the cost of those reagents coming down to a reasonable level, right? And then our understanding of real-time PCR and developing normal levels. And so we can use that CT value we get from a real-time PCR to give us a relative idea on viral load. It's not a truly quantitative assay, but it does give us a trend and a pattern over time to continue to monitor. And this vaccine take, if we do them, we want to sample individual birds because we want to know out of the population that we sample, how many of those birds post-vaccination actually have vaccine virus present, number one. And then number two, we want to see that relative level. So we look at the CT values of those individual samples, and then we compare them both within our sample set. Are they pretty tightly distributed? Are they very widely distributed? And then we maybe look at different farms that were sampled. How does each farm look? So is there consistency in our method from day to day in the hatchery? And then we look over time, right? Do we see differences in summer versus winter? Or do we see differences when we change from using a coccidia vaccine in combination with respiratory to just respiratory vaccine application? So there's a lot of different parameters and different ways we can kind of slice that data up. But the vaccine take in and of itself is just going into the bird at a specified time point post-vaccination, sampling, and then running real-time PCR to understand how many of those birds received a vaccine and how much vaccine is there.
Now, if I understand the research correctly, Dr. Jordan, your study found some pretty dramatic differences between different strains, say C2 versus B1. I wonder if you could walk us through those take rate differences and what we learned as you started peeling the layers of the onion there.
Sure. Yeah. So when we started doing the vaccine takes for Newcastle, honestly, we really didn't know what to expect because it's not something that we had really done before. But again, with the advent of PCR and within the pretty specific criteria of sampling birds that were vaccinated with a live attenuated Newcastle vaccine, we did want to understand, were there differences in vaccine type? Again, in my previous life at PDRC, we could see differences in bronchitis vaccine strain, both from a serotype or strain standpoint, but also from a manufacturer standpoint. And we wanted to see if the same pattern would hold true across other respiratory viruses. And within live attenuated Newcastle vaccines, there are several different strain varieties. You've got your classic, more virulent strain that we typically don't use in broilers. But within the broiler group, you have a strain that's called VGGA, which is actually from PDRC. If we go back to Viegas glycin, and that's where the VG and GA is for Georgia. So it's a classic strain. It has more of an enteric tropism, but it is considered a little bit more of a moderate level pathogenic strain. You've got your B1 type strains, which are a little bit milder. And then you've got your cloned B1 strains, which would be the C2, that are widely considered the mildest vaccine. A C2 strain has been a popular option in the broiler industry because it is so mild, considering that we are going to be giving this live attenuated Newcastle vaccine in combination with other respiratory vaccines, at a minimum, live infectious bronchitis vaccines as well. And so we don't want to overwhelm the bird. We don't want to increase the significance of vaccine reaction. And so that C2 strain has become a very popular option because of the attenuation level and the mildness in the interaction. However, when we started doing vaccine takes to understand what the replication dynamics of these vaccines look like, we saw that when we tested C2 strain vaccines, we just did not see very good vaccine takes. A lot of times the vaccine take would be 0%. Every once in a while, we have a sample set that would come in at 80, 90% positive. So there were some good ones mixed in, but by and large, the majority of those vaccine takes are 20% positive or less at 7 days post-vaccination. Compare that to a B1 or even a BGGA strain, where we see typically anywhere from 70 to 80% at a minimum, up to 100% positivity at that same 7-day post-vaccination time point.
Yeah, and you throw those numbers out there, and it's just far be it from me as a wannabe economist to say, "Gosh, those sound low." But when you put it out there like that, I'm curious what that low take rates that you were seeing in some of those samples suggest about real world flock protection and how concerned we might be bigger picture about what that data tells us.
So when we do vaccine takes, what we are trying to assess is herd health or flock immunity, right? And we truly are looking at population health in this sense. You can imagine the number of broilers that are produced every day, and we vaccinate 100 at a time, 250,000 in a day in a standard hatchery, that one or two are going to get missed along the way, right? We're not going to be perfect in this endeavor. But if we think about flock immunity and trying to understand what that minimum level of infection needs to be, we start looking at that 70%, 80% number as kind of our minimum window. And these are live attenuated vaccines. They are still live viruses. They have the ability to infect and replicate and have the potential to shed and infect other birds in the population. And we rely on that fact to truly get flock immunity, again, because of the mass application nature and the number of birds that we are vaccinating on a daily basis. But if you don't get enough of the population vaccinated up front, what you then create is a situation where you've got more naive birds than you do vaccinated birds. And so that vaccine will then shed from the subset of the population that was vaccinated to another naive set of the population. Then it will infect and replicate in those birds, potentially to a higher level than it did before. And then those birds will shed it to potentially now a third naive population as that vaccine then rolls through a house. And so that's sort of the classic scenario for what we call a vaccine roll, where it's just being shed back and forth between different populations in a house. And as we know, with all of these vaccines being lab attenuated, there is the potential for some vaccine reaction, a little bit of mild respiratory distress, because these are live pathogens infecting and replicating. But the longer we allow them to replicate or encourage them to replicate in a house, particularly as the birds get older, they're gaining a lot of weight. You've got the housing environment, the density becomes higher because the birds are getting bigger. all those things can lead to an even more exaggerated reaction as the birds get older.
I tipped my hand a little bit there when I joked about being a wannabe economist, but I'm going to go further down this line. So, from an integrator's perspective, I'm wondering why this poor take rates are concerned about vaccination and what we're achieving there. Let's start thinking about that economically, because I'm assuming we're going to see some costs show up. Obviously, we're spending money to do this, but give me all the implications as you start thinking through the economic dollars and cents of the challenge that you've just described from what the research has shown us.
Right. So economic impacts could be evaluated in a few different ways, right? So if you do have, let's take the scenario I just described, where you've got a rolling vaccine. And again, you're seeing more reactivity every time that vaccine rolls as the birds get older. Well, now the immune system is having to respond to that vaccine, and the bird is spending energy in the immune system fighting something rather than putting that energy toward growth, feed conversion, right? So you're going to see a little bit of a performance hit. You could in growth rate and feed conversion, weight, daily weight gain, things like that. The second scenario would be these vaccines, all of them, if you go across the board in the Newcastle space, are relatively mild. We have a low challenge in the US. So being relatively mild, even if they don't have a significant performance impact, it is another thing that the bird is having to respond to. And as that bird gets older, you've got bursal disease virus that's going to come in at some point. You got environmental factors like E. coli, your gut health parameters, you've got coccidia. So you're just stacking straws on the camel's back, if you will, from a disease perspective. Right. And then lastly, even though we do have a relatively low Newcastle challenge, there are pockets within the US that do have some lingering moderate level challenge virus out there. And so if you don't get the birds well immunized up front when they should be going through that immune reaction, that priming reaction to really stimulate the immune system to develop your mucosal antibodies, your circulatory antibodies, the memory cells in their immune system, then they can be left open susceptible to an actual challenge later on. And over the last 12 months, we have seen just a little bit of, again, just kind of smoldering in the background, some cases of actual Newcastle detection in older birds that were not the velogenic form, but just a moderate sort of lingering infection that's out there.
I got to give you credit. You answered that the way an economist would appreciate, because we always say the economist joke is on the one hand, but on the other hand. And you say, well, we can evaluate this a few different ways. That's excellent. And realistically, right, that's real world. So I want to start then, if we shift from what we know here from the research to practical implications. So if you're giving advice to an integrator, so thinking about their vaccination strategy protocol, what are things you would suggest we start doing differently based on your research and the implications we've just been talking about? How should I think about this problem and protocol in a different way than maybe I have been traditionally?
I always, being of research background for a majority of my career, I always like to follow the data. And so the first thing that I always encourage is we have the capability to collect the samples, to run the diagnostics, to understand the picture with our vaccines. So let's go do that first. All right, let's understand what our vaccines are doing right now before any changes or any interventions are put in place. A corollary piece to all of this that is adjacent but has a major impact on vaccination is actual vaccine application. I spent a lot of time researching that at the University of Georgia as well. And so it could be that what we see as a potential vaccine problem is really just an application issue. We need to go work with our personnel in the hatchery on our SOPs and our processes. But doing the vaccine takes will help us understand that, right? If the Newcastle takes don't look good, but neither do the bronchitis takes, then we know that it's an application issue. Let's correct that situation, come back and reevaluate the program again, doing more vaccine takes. Then once we feel like we've got our process under control, we're still seeing the same patterns, then we start investigating, all right, are there other options? Are there other strains that are available? What vaccines are available on the market? Do we even decide, is it appropriate to think about a recombinant instead of a live attenuated if you're in an area where you have other factors that you need to control with your live attenuated program? Like I said, we always follow the data, let the data tell us where to go, and make sure that we have all of our processes buttoned up, and then we'll start looking at our vaccine choices.
All right, now I'm going to pretend we were talking about the integrator. I'm going to pretend I'm a veterinarian for a minute. And I wonder if you give me some advice as I'm evaluating my vaccine program options. What are questions I should be asking my vaccine supplier based on all of the things we've been talking about?
So the first question would be, what kind of data do you have on vaccine takes? What does it look like from a replication infection dynamic? How does your vaccine interact with other vaccines that I'm going to be giving as part of my program? Let's look at my total flock health through other surveys. Do I have other confounding factors like bursal disease, or what's my bronchitis program that's going to interact with a live Newcastle program? Most vaccine manufacturers have data where they've looked at interactions or at least compatibility of different vaccines being applied together by spray and or by gel. There are some unique vaccine combinations out there. Some hatcheries have very unique ideas on which vaccines they want to put together to control their specific disease situation. And that's one thing I like to tell everyone. They ask, well, how should I set up my program, or how do I need to apply the vaccine? And say every hatchery, every complex is different. They're all unique. And so there's not one answer. But when we go in and we look, we evaluate the process, we evaluate the program and the vaccines being used, we have resources available. And that would be the question to ask, is what resources do you have to show that what you're proposing is going to work?
We've been talking about the data and PCR monitoring and how much more feasible that is now than it was a few years ago. I'm curious today, how practical is it for us to implement routine PCR monitoring in commercial operations? What's that realistically look like today? And maybe what are the barriers you see to more widespread adoption?
Realistically, it's quite feasible to do, but it will depend on how and where you want it done. There's a cost to associated with everything. Nothing in life is free, but your vaccine manufacturers, I know for us at Zoetis, we have our own diagnostic lab, diagnostic service, where we will do these vaccine takes for customers if they're interested to see what the vaccines are doing in the bird. Other vaccine companies have the same service that they can offer. There are many diagnostic labs across the United States that run real-time PCR as their main source of diagnostic testing. But as you go to diagnostic labs, then the cost will vary there. So the cost and the number of samples can be a barrier. Vaccine takes are a little unique compared to sort of general flock health or general surveillance, because we are testing those samples individually. And our typical program is, we really want to know how well both the vaccine is doing and the process, how well that's going. I like to take 15 samples per location, 6 locations at a time, to give me 90 samples. That fits nicely for a diagnostic perspective because most of these machines come in 96 well plate format. So that leaves me space for controls, different positive and negative assay controls that are needed to run with the samples. That's the cheapest way to do it. That's the highest throughput. But there are machines now that can run 384 samples at a time. So flow through and throughput really aren't a barrier anymore, where they may have been maybe 10 years ago. So it's just going to be the cost that's associated with being able to do that. Feasibility, though, it's not something that you have to do every week or even particularly every month. I like to start with maybe a once a quarter program. Let's just spot check and see. And if the data comes back looking good and everything was consistent, then we can assume the hatchery's following the process, the vaccine's doing a good job. But if we get a data set back where it seems like we've got some issues, maybe that are associated with vaccination, with the process, then we're able to help the team out and go in the hatchery, do some process evaluations. Let's understand maybe where some pinch points are. And then we'll want to follow up again fairly soon to make sure that those corrections, those interventions actually had a positive impact. Conversely, if we're doing general kind of disease surveillance and we're seeing some issues kind of linger or crop up routinely, we'll work backwards to the hatchery to understand, all right, is this process going well? Let me check that first. Then we can better understand the field disease situation. It could be time for a vaccine change.
Wonder, we talked about some of the differences in strains earlier on. I wonder if you might shed a little light on the merits of strain-based vaccine selection compared to maybe a brand-based approach to vaccine selection, and what your experience and advice is there.
Yeah. So, and for Newcastle, it's an interesting topic, because if you look through the textbook, right, and you go through what's in diseases of poultry in the manual, even though there are different strains of Newcastle disease, and there are, I believe, 14 different genotype lineages of Newcastle disease, serotypically, they are all recognized the same way by the bird. At least that's what the book tells us. I think we see some examples now in the field and in the literature where maybe that's not 100%. There might be some slight variation there. So the conversation around strain-based vaccine selection for Newcastle is really more about the vaccine itself and the vaccine take. And When we look at the different strains, the strains are associated with the potential level of kind of reactivity, where again, all of them are quite mild vaccines, but we all know that there are levels to mildness, and that mildness is associated with attenuation. And so as you go through the attenuation process, sometimes characteristics change, traits change. And so as we found, again, unexpectedly, because we just had not done it before, but when we started doing these Newcastle takes, we saw that the strain difference was really kind of related more to that. Not so much that the bird sees it any differently, but just that the vaccines didn't infect and replicate in the same way.
Brian, as we finish up here, I wonder if you were going to offer one key takeaway. If somebody just tuned in at the last minute and said, all right, tell me what you talked about. If you wanted to give folks one thing you really wanted them to walk away with from our conversation today, what would it be?
That utilizing vaccine takes is a great way to qualitatively and semi-quantitatively assess your vaccination program. And that can be done. We've been discussing Newcastle disease vaccines. It can be done for almost every vaccine that we give in the hatchery. There are labs, there are services that offer these assays for you. The data is out there and available. And so making decisions for your vaccine program and for flock health based off of data-driven approaches is much more feasible now than it was 10 years ago. And I would highly recommend reaching out to someone and setting up some of these testings if that's something you're interested in.
Dr. Brian Jordan of Zoetis, running their technical services team for the poultry business. Really great conversation. Appreciate you sharing your research, insights, and advice on an important topic and something that has some real economic consequences for producers. Good advice for veterinarians as well. Friends, if you enjoyed this conversation, would encourage you subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And if you don't mind, toss a rating on there as well. It helps us get exposed to other folks who might enjoy the conversation. Reminder, we are here each week with professionals from the poultry science community like Dr. Jordan. And if you want to make sure you don't miss an episode, hey, maybe follow us on LinkedIn, where we provide a ton of up-to-date information on this podcast, as well as all of the programming available to you from the Poultry Science Association. We also love to highlight some of the achievements of our members. A lot of great content on our LinkedIn page. Just go to LinkedIn and search for Poultry Science Association. Next Tuesday, I want you to join us for a webinar. I'm really excited about this one because we're looking at the implications of generative artificial intelligence in the college classroom, opportunities and obstacles. Dr. Liz Karcher, Dr. Jason Emmert, two of the leading teaching experts in our field, will dive into one of the most pressing issues facing college educators today. That'll be generative AI in the classroom next Tuesday, November 4th, noon Central, 1 o'clock Eastern. You can register at poultryscience.org. Great opportunity for you to listen to two really bright speakers on the implications of teaching and generative AI. This episode of Unplugged was produced by Lindsay Johnston with editing and engineering by Michael Londa Parasol. That's it for this week. For the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance. See you next time.